Welcome to this episode of Great Cities and Institutions. Today, we are going to look at the history of the Vatican, the smallest country on Earth, and the most contested acre of ground in Europe. Every week on this channel, we step inside the great cities, empires, and institutions that shaped the world we still live in today, tracing not just when they rose, but why, and what it actually cost to build something meant to last forever. Some of these stories are about walls and monuments still standing. Others are about entire systems of government and belief that vanished centuries ago, yet somehow still shape how we live, how we're governed, and even the words we use, without most of us ever realizing it. Today's story belongs to a place smaller than many city parks, with fewer permanent residents than a single apartment tower, that nonetheless issues its own passports, mints its own coins, runs its own radio station, employs its own astronomers, maintains diplomatic relations with more than 180 countries, and speaks with authority to well over 1 billion people scattered across every continent on Earth. It began as a stretch of marshy ground that ancient Romans considered unlucky and avoided. It became an execution ground, and it ended up as the headquarters of the longest continuously functioning institution in the Western world. This is the secret history of the Vatican. How a cursed hillside outside the walls of Rome became a sovereign state. How the church that governs it was very nearly destroyed by the cost of its own cathedral. And how a single stone column standing in the middle of St. Peter's Square has silently watched almost the entire story unfold. Let's begin with the ground itself, because the Vatican was never supposed to be anything at all. In the days of the Roman Republic, the area we now call the Vatican was not part of the city of Rome. It lay across the Tiber, outside the sacred boundary, on the wrong side of the river. The Romans called the district Ager Vaticanus, the Vatican Field, and the name almost certainly comes from an older Etruscan settlement in the area, though the exact origin has been debated for centuries. What the Romans agreed on was the character of the place. It was low, damp, and prone to flooding. The water was bad. The wine grown there was considered poor. The Roman writer Tacitus mentions the district's unhealthy air, and there was a general sense that it was an ill-omened stretch of ground, the sort of place you passed through rather than settled in. That reputation is precisely why it was used for the things Romans preferred to keep outside the city: burial grounds, tombs, and eventually, under the emperors, a circus. The Circus of Nero, sometimes called the Circus of Caligula because Caligula began it, was a chariot racing arena built on the Vatican Field in the 1st century. It was not one of Rome's great venues. It was a secondary track, well outside the center. But it was there, according to Christian tradition, that a great many of the first Christians in Rome were put to death during Nero's persecution following the Fire of 64, and it was there, tradition holds, that the Apostle Peter was executed. To be careful and honest about this, the historical evidence is thinner than most people assume. There is no contemporary account of Peter's death written by an eyewitness. The tradition that he was crucified in Rome, and crucified head downward at his own request because he did not consider himself worthy of dying in the same manner as Christ, appears in Christian writings from the late 1st and 2nd centuries. Historians differ on how much weight those sources can carry. What is much better established is that by the middle of the 2nd century, Christians in Rome were venerating a specific spot on the Vatican Hill as Peter's burial place, and that they had been doing so for some time. A Roman priest named Gaius, writing around the year 200, refers to a monument, or trophy marking the apostle's grave on the Vatican. That single detail is the hinge on which the whole rest of this story turns. Everything that follows, the basilica, the papacy's physical seat, the smallest country in the world, exists because of where a group of 2nd century Christians believed a body was buried. And that belief was tested, quite literally, in the 20th century. In 1939, workmen preparing a burial place for Pope Pius XI in the grottos beneath St. Peter's Basilica broke through into something unexpected. Below the floor lay an entire Roman street of the dead, a necropolis of mausoleums, remarkably well preserved because the ground had been deliberately filled in and built over centuries earlier. Pope Pius XII authorized a full excavation, conducted quietly through the Second World War and for years afterward. What the archaeologists uncovered was a pagan cemetery, with Christian burials appearing among the pagan tombs as the centuries progressed, and at the center of it, directly beneath the high altar of the basilica, a simple shrine. The bones found nearby became the subject of decades of argument. In 1968, Pope Paul VI announced that the relics of St. Peter had been identified. Many archaeologists remain unconvinced, and the identification has never been settled to universal satisfaction. What is beyond dispute is that the basilica was built with extraordinary care to place its altar directly above that ancient shrine, and that whoever built it believed absolutely in what lay beneath. The man who built it was Constantine. In the early 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and then became its patron. Around the year 320, he ordered a basilica raised on the Vatican Hill over Peter's shrine. This was not a straightforward building project. The hillside sloped. The ground was unstable. To create a level platform, engineers had to cut away part of the hill on one side and build up an enormous retaining structure on the other, burying the entire necropolis in the process, which is exactly why it survived so well for archaeologists 16 centuries later. They filled the tombs with earth, sealed them, and laid a floor over the top. The result was Old St. Peter's Basilica, a vast structure that would stand for roughly 1,200 years. And it is worth pausing on the sheer strangeness of the decision. Constantine had all of Rome available to him. He chose to build his greatest church on the far side of the river, on unstable ground, on a site the Romans had historically considered unlucky, at enormous engineering expense, for one reason only. He would not move the altar away from the grave. For the next several centuries, the Vatican was not the center of papal life. The popes lived at the Lateran Palace on the other side of Rome, which had been given to the church by Constantine and which remained the official papal residence for around 1,000 years. St. Peter's was a pilgrimage destination, a shrine, an increasingly important one, but not the seat of government. The transformation of the papacy from a religious office into a territorial power came in the 8th century, and it came out of a crisis. The Lombards were pressing on Rome. The Byzantine emperor, nominally the city's protector, was too distant and too distracted to help. So the Pope turned instead to the Franks. In 754, Pope Stephen II crossed the Alps and appealed to Pepin the Short. Pepin marched into Italy, defeated the Lombards, and in 756 handed the conquered territories not back to the Byzantines, who arguably had the better legal claim, but to the Pope. This is the donation of Pepin, and it created the Papal States, a broad band of territory across central Italy governed directly by the papacy. For the next 1100 years, the Pope was not only a spiritual leader but a temporal monarch with borders, subjects, taxes, courts, prisons, and armies. And to justify that authority, someone produced a document. The donation of Constantine claimed that Emperor Constantine, grateful to Pope Sylvester for curing him of leprosy, had granted the papacy dominion over Rome and the entire Western Empire. It was cited repeatedly through the medieval period as the legal foundation of papal temporal power. It was also a forgery, probably manufactured in the 8th or 9th century. The man who proved it was a Renaissance scholar named Lorenzo Valla, and the way he proved it changed how history itself is studied. In 1440, Valla examined the document's Latin and demonstrated that it simply could not have been written in the 4th century. It used words that did not yet exist. It described institutions and titles that had not yet been invented. It referred to Constantinople as a patriarchate at a point when it was not yet one. Valla's analysis is now regarded as one of the founding works of modern textual criticism, the technique of dating a document by its own internal language. It is a genuinely remarkable episode. The most important legal document underpinning papal territorial claims was exposed as fraudulent by a scholar reading it closely, roughly 700 years after it was written. The medieval papacy that rested on those claims was not a story of steady ascent. It was chaotic, frequently violent, and at times close to collapse. In the 10th century, the papacy fell under the control of powerful Roman families who installed and deposed popes at will, a period historians have not been gentle about naming. In 1271, after cardinals had spent nearly 3 years failing to elect a pope, the frustrated citizens of Viterbo locked them into the building, cut their rations to bread and water, and reportedly removed the roof to expose them to the weather. It worked. A pope was elected, and it established the principle behind the word conclave, which comes from the Latin cum clave, meaning with a key. Locked in. Then, in 1309, the papacy left Rome entirely. For 68 years the popes resided at Avignon in southern France, under heavy French influence, in a period sometimes called the Babylonian captivity of the Church. Rome, abandoned by the institution that had sustained it, decayed badly. Old St. Peter's fell into serious disrepair. When the papacy finally returned in 1377, the dispute over the move produced something worse. The Western Schism split the Church between rival claimants to the papal throne, and at its most confused there were 3 men simultaneously claiming to be pope, each with his own supporters, his own cardinals, and his own administration. It took the Council of Constance, ending in 1418, to resolve it. The papacy that emerged from that century of crisis was determined to rebuild, and to rebuild spectacularly. Which brings us to the most consequential decision in the Vatican's architectural history, and one of the most controversial. By the early 1500s, Constantine's basilica was 1,200 years old and in genuine structural trouble. Walls were leaning. Foundations were failing. Something had to be done. Pope Julius II decided that what should be done was to knock it down and start again. The reaction was not favorable. This was one of the most sacred buildings in Christendom, filled with the tombs of popes and emperors, saturated in 12 centuries of history. To demolish it struck many as close to sacrilege. The architect Julius appointed, Donato Bramante, pursued the demolition with such energy that Roman wits gave him a nickname that stuck, Il Ruinante, the ruiner. Construction of the new St. Peter's began in 1506. It would not be completed until 1626. 120 years. More than 20 popes. A succession of the greatest architects of the age, each modifying or reversing his predecessor's plans, including Bramante, Raphael, Antonio da San Gallo, Michelangelo, Carlo Maderno, and finally Bernini, who designed the vast enclosing colonnade of the square. Michelangelo took charge of the project in 1546, at the age of 71, and refused any payment for the work. He designed the dome that still defines the Roman skyline, though he did not live to see it finished. He was in his late 80s when he died in 1564, and the dome was completed by others working from his model. But the cost of all this had to come from somewhere, and the method chosen to raise it fractured Western Christianity permanently. To fund the construction, the Church expanded the sale of indulgences, which in the practice of the time meant payments that were preached as reducing the punishment due for sin. A Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel conducted an especially aggressive selling campaign in the German lands, and the slogan attributed to him, whether or not he actually said it in those words, captured what many people heard, that as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. In 1517, a German monk and university lecturer named Martin Luther wrote out 95 theses objecting to the practice. The popular image of him hammering them to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg may or may not be accurate, historians differ, but the document itself unquestionably circulated, and the printing press carried it across Europe faster than any authority could respond. The consequence is one of the great ironies of European history. The effort to finance the most magnificent church building in the world helped trigger the Reformation, which permanently divided the institution that was building it. St. Peter's was completed. The unity of Western Christianity was not restored. Before we go further, there is a smaller building on the Vatican grounds that deserves its own attention, and a persistent myth attached to it that is worth correcting. The Sistine Chapel takes its name from Pope Sixtus IV, who had it built in the 1470s. Michelangelo painted its ceiling between 1508 and 1512, and he did not want the job. He considered himself a sculptor, not a painter, and he took the commission under pressure from Julius II. Here is the myth. Almost everyone believes Michelangelo painted that ceiling lying flat on his back. He did not. He designed and built a scaffold that allowed him to work standing upright, leaning backward, head tilted up, arms raised above him for hours at a stretch. That is not more comfortable than lying down. In a letter to a friend, written as a poem, he described his beard pointing at the ceiling, his spine compressed, his skin stretched taut in front and bunched behind, and paint dripping steadily onto his face. He wrote that he had grown a goiter from the strain and that he was not in a good place, and he was not being entirely metaphorical. Some 22 years later he returned to paint the Last Judgment on the altar wall, and that work caused its own scandal. The volume of nudity in it offended a number of senior figures, and after Michelangelo's death a painter was engaged to add drapery to the figures. He acquired his own nickname for it, Il Bragatone, the breeches maker. Now, back to the fortunes of the Vatican as a state, because the 16th century very nearly ended it. In 1527, the unpaid and mutinous army of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V descended on Rome and sacked it with a ferocity that shocked Europe. Churches were looted. The population was massacred in large numbers. Pope Clement VII fled along the elevated covered passage that connects the Vatican to the fortress of Castel Sant'Angelo, a corridor built precisely for that purpose, and held out there. He escaped because the Swiss guard held the line at the basilica steps while he ran. Of roughly 189 guards, about 147 were killed. The date was the 6th of May, and to this day new recruits to the Pontifical Swiss Guard are sworn in on the 6th of May in memory of it. The Swiss Guard remains the Vatican's military force, and while the striking striped uniform is often attributed to Michelangelo, that attribution is not supported by evidence, and the current design dates from the early 20th century. The Papal States survived the sack and endured for another 3 centuries. What finally ended them was Italian nationalism. Through the 1800s, the movement to unify Italy steadily absorbed the papal territories. The final act came in 1870. With French troops that had been protecting Rome withdrawn to fight in the Franco-Prussian War, Italian forces breached the city wall at Porta Pia on the 20th of September and took Rome. It became the capital of a unified Italy. The Papal States, after roughly 1100 years, ceased to exist. Pope Pius IX refused to accept it. He rejected the Italian government's offered terms, declared himself a prisoner in the Vatican, and withdrew inside its walls. So did his successors. For 59 years, the popes did not set foot outside the Vatican grounds, treating themselves as captives of an illegitimate occupation. Catholics in Italy were, for a period, discouraged from participating in the new state's elections. The standoff was resolved in 1929, and by an uncomfortable partner. The Lateran Treaty was negotiated between the Holy See and Mussolini's fascist government. Italy recognized Vatican City as a sovereign independent state, compensated the papacy financially for the lost territories, and granted Catholicism special standing in Italian law. The Holy See in turn recognized the Kingdom of Italy with Rome as its capital. That treaty, signed on the 11th of February 1929, is the legal birth certificate of the country that exists today. Vatican City covers about 44 hectares, roughly 110 acres, which makes it the smallest sovereign state in the world by both area and population. Its permanent population is in the region of 800 people, and a substantial portion of those are Swiss guards and clergy. Almost nobody is born there. Citizenship is generally tied to office and function rather than birth, and it ends when the role ends. The Second World War placed the new microstate in an extraordinarily difficult position, and the record of Pope Pius XII during that period remains one of the most contested subjects in modern religious history. He has been defended on the grounds that the Vatican sheltered substantial numbers of Jews in its properties and in monasteries and convents across Rome, and that public denunciation would have provoked reprisals and ended that work. He has been criticized on the grounds that he never issued a clear, explicit public condemnation of the extermination of European Jews when his voice carried unique moral weight. The Vatican opened its archives from his pontificate to researchers in 2020, and historians are still working through them. It is a debate that has not concluded, and anyone who tells you it is simple is overstating what the evidence supports. Let's turn now to what the Vatican actually is today, because much of it is stranger than the popular image suggests. Start with the archives, and with a mistranslation that has fueled conspiracy theories for generations. The Vatican's secret archives are not secret. The Latin name, Archivum Secretum, uses secretum in its older sense of private or personal, as in a private secretary. It meant the Pope's own archive, as distinct from the public library. Because the English word drifted over the centuries into implying concealment, the institution has been the subject of endless speculation about hidden knowledge. In 2019, Pope Francis formally renamed it the Vatican Apostolic Archive, largely to end the confusion. The archive is genuinely vast. Estimates put the shelving at around 85 kilometers, roughly 53 miles, holding documents spanning more than 12 centuries. Qualified researchers can apply for access. Material is generally released by pontificate, which is why the Pius XII papers only opened in 2020. Among the holdings are the trial records of Galileo, correspondence from Michelangelo, and a letter from English nobles to Pope Clement VII in 1530 urging him to grant Henry VIII his annulment, still carrying its dangling wax seals. Separately, the Vatican Apostolic Library holds one of the most significant manuscript collections in existence, including the Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest substantially complete manuscripts of the Greek Bible, dating to around the 4th century. The Vatican museums, which now draw around 6 million visitors a year, also began almost by accident, with a single object pulled out of the ground. In January of 1506, a landowner digging in a vineyard near the Colosseum struck marble. Julius II sent his architect Giuliano da Sangallo to look, and Sangallo brought Michelangelo along. What emerged from the soil was the Laocoon, a Greek sculptural group showing a Trojan priest and his 2 sons being crushed by sea serpents, a work described by the Roman writer Pliny the Elder and lost for well over 1,000 years. Julius bought it within the month and put it on public display in a courtyard at the Vatican. That courtyard is generally regarded as the origin of the museums. The statue's writhing, agonized bodies had an immediate and lasting effect on Renaissance art, and its influence is visible in Michelangelo's own work from that point onward. Then there is the money, which has produced real scandal. The Institute for the Works of Religion, commonly called the Vatican Bank, was drawn into one of the murkiest financial affairs of the 20th century through its links to Banco Ambrosiano, an Italian bank that collapsed in 1982 amid enormous losses. Its chairman, Roberto Calvi, known in the press as God's banker, was found dead hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London in June of that year, his pockets weighted with stones. An initial verdict of suicide was later overturned, and the case has never been resolved to anyone's satisfaction. The Vatican Bank has undergone repeated waves of reform and investigation in the decades since. There is also, and this genuinely surprises people, an astronomical observatory. The Vatican Observatory is one of the oldest in the world, with roots stretching back to papal involvement in the calendar reform of 1582 that produced the Gregorian calendar still in general use. Its headquarters sit at Castel Gandolfo outside Rome, and because light pollution over Italy made serious observation impractical, it now operates a research telescope in Arizona, in partnership with the University of Arizona. Its staff are working astronomers who publish in peer-reviewed journals, several of them Jesuits. The Vatican also runs a radio service broadcasting in dozens of languages, issues its own passports and postage stamps, mints euro coins that are legal tender across the Eurozone and are heavily sought by collectors, has its own pharmacy, its own railway station with a very short line, and its own fire brigade. It has no airport, no farms, no maternity ward, and no cemetery in the ordinary sense. You may have heard that the Vatican has the highest crime rate per capita on Earth. This claim circulates widely, and it needs qualifying. The figure comes from dividing offenses reported in Vatican territory, overwhelmingly pickpocketing and petty theft committed against the millions of tourists who pass through each year, by a resident population of a few hundred. Almost none of it is committed by residents. It is a statistical artifact of a tiny denominator, not a measure of a dangerous place. And when a pope dies or resigns, the process that follows is one of the oldest continuous electoral procedures anywhere in the world. The cardinal electors, those under the age of 80, gather in the Sistine Chapel. The doors are sealed. They vote by secret ballot, and the ballots are burned after each round, with chemicals added to produce black smoke for an inconclusive vote and white smoke for a successful one. The stove and the chimney above the chapel remain, in an age of instantaneous global communication, the official first announcement to the world. Which brings us back, finally, to where we started, and to the one object that has watched all of it. In the center of St. Peter's Square stands an Egyptian obelisk of red granite, roughly 25 meters tall and weighing well over 300 tons. It was quarried in Egypt and brought to Rome by the Emperor Caligula in the year 37, and erected on the spine of the Circus on the Vatican field. It stood there through Nero's persecutions. It stood through the construction of Constantine's Basilica in the 4th century. It stood, largely ignored, through 1200 years of the medieval papacy. In 1586, Pope Sixtus V ordered it moved to the center of the square. The operation took months, required an estimated 900 men, 75 horses, and a vast timber framework, and it is the source of one of Rome's most enduring stories, that during the most delicate stage of the lift the crowd had been ordered to keep absolute silence on pain of death, until a sailor in the crowd shouted that the ropes were burning and must be wetted, saving the operation. It is a good story, and it may well be a legend, but the obelisk stands there today regardless. It is the only obelisk in Rome that has never fallen. Emperors who ordered it raised are gone. The circus it decorated is gone. The basilica it stood beside for 12 centuries is gone, demolished and replaced. The papal states are gone. The kingdom that seized them is gone. 2 world wars have passed around it. And it is still standing, in the middle of a square, in the smallest country on earth, at the center of an institution that began with a group of 2nd century believers who thought they knew where a fisherman had been buried, on a stretch of ground the Romans avoided because they thought it was unlucky. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of the great cities, empires, and institutions that built the world we live in. Leave a comment below telling us which city or institution you would like us to explore next.